Hi there, and welcome to this very special episode of Fantasy for the Ages, where father and son sit down and talk about some fantasy books. I'm the son of that equation, Zach.
And I'm the father, Jim, laughing that my son has props today.
I'm topical.
Props. Very, very good. Great to have all of you with us again here for this episode, another one of our to read or not to read episodes, where we will not fully spoil something, but we will give you a top level understanding of what a particular book series we're talking about is about and our thoughts on it to help influence whether you should read or not read this one. Before we jump into all that sort of stuff, Zach, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. We're recording this episode after an episode that we just recorded. I'm not sure which one actually drops first in our lineup, actually.
The other one.
Either way, it's pretty obvious. I'm still wearing the same clothes. I did, however, eat some leftover Korean food, so I have a happier tummy. How are you doing, Dad?
Well, being I'm on West Coast time instead of Central time, it's still late afternoon. I'm not hungry yet. I'm doing fine. We did have a fairly long episode for that last one, so we pushed this recording back about 10 minutes. But
a little bit.
I'm ready to go. Let's do this, huh? And these are never quite as long.
Now, notably, I will mention I wasn't hungry due to the time. I was hungry due to my irresponsibility because I hadn't eaten yet today. But that happens.
At all?
I had coffee.
No, that doesn't count. You didn't have breakfast? Okay. Most important meal of the day, son.
When was the last time you knew me to regularly eat breakfast?
Yeah,
I'll tell you. Sixth grade.
It's a fail. Oh, well. I did have breakfast. I did not have lunch, but I commonly skip lunch. I'll have it sometimes. Never a heavy one. Breakfast and dinner. Those are the meals I need. And
I
dinner,
just realized
I have to cook when we're all done today.
I did lie. On my way back from work, I got some fries. So I did have something to eat around lunchtime.
See?
It's just such a rare occurrence. I forgot about it.
Nutritious, healthy lunch. Fries.
It's potatoes, boiled, mash them, stick them in a stew.
Whose fries, though?
Whataburger.
I don't know if I've had Whataburger.
That's because you don't live in Texas. It's one of the three branches of the government, along with HEB,
Really?
and Buc-ee's. Yeah.
Whataburger. All right.
Whataburger,
next
HEB, and Buc-ee's.
Next time we visit, we'll have to do a Whataburger, I guess. Just because. All right. Let's see. What are we drinking? I am drinking something different now. From last episode, I just went and opened up some red wine. It's Italian, and
red wine.
Get it? It's called Vino Rosso, which I think just means red wine in Italian. So
Sounds
literally, it's
right.
just red wine. It's nothing real fancy, and it's nothing real good.
It's Italian box wine.
A little tart.
It's
not drink
for
it all.
Cooking. It's for cooking with, and you're drinking.
No, you do not cook with bad wine, because then you get bad food. You cook with good wine because you want good food. All right, what are you drinking?
Drink the good wine. I just switched over to some non-branded cola because I had a nice drink, but want to function later, so I'm not going to keep drinking. We condone drinking responsibly. Not drinking too much irresponsibly.
Also, it is just fine to listen to our content without drinking. No pressure. Yes.
Though I do recommend, if you aren't drinking anything, drink some water. It's good for you.
Yeah, I did just record recently one of our Dresden Files episodes with guest Drew McCaffrey. And
currently
he came on
drinking, correct?
Didn't drink anything. That's right.
I believe
that's right.
So.
He had some oh man, I can't remember what it was. It was a brand name thing people know of, but it was non-alcoholic. So it was fine. And he enjoyed it. So that is just fine. All right. What are we focusing on today then with our to read or not to read? A series I have been looking forward to talking about for quite some time. So we're going to talk about Anne McCaffrey's The Dragonriders of Pern today. It's a series that I loved as far back as a teenager. I'll talk about my history with it a little later. And Zach, you've dabbled in it. You'll have a chance to talk about it later too.
Yeah, I've read some.
Yeah. Reminder, again, we're not going to spoil the whole series. What we will talk about, though, is highly subjective. We are not experts in literature. We're just going to be sharing our feelings and opinions about these particular books. And we'll see if we inspire you to want to read them. If you've already read them, we'll see if you agree with our thoughts on them. But whatever we do say about them, we're going to try to give legit rationale for why we think as we do. There you go. Just the facts on these books. The Dragonriders of Pern begins all the way back in 1968. Technically, 1967. The first book, Dragonflight, was published in 68. But before it was published as a novel, it actually came out as 2 novellas. Most of what ended up in Dragonflight came out as 2 separate novellas published in 2 different editions of a science fiction magazine in 1967. Based upon how they were received, they were put together, fleshed out a little more to make it a true novel, and published in 1968 as Dragonflight. A follow-up book, Dragon Quest, came out in 1970. And then what is considered the original trilogy wrapped up with the 3rd book, The White Dragon, in 1978. Now that's 8-year gap there. In the interim, there was actually 3 other books, sorta, and this is a little wonky. There are 3 books, another trilogy that has been come to be called the Harper Hall of Pern trilogy. So in 1976, it was Dragon's Song. 1977 was Dragon Singer. And then 1979 was Dragon Drums. Now, those first 2, Dragon Song and Dragon Singer, directly tie into each other. It's like picking right up, continuing the story. Dragon Drums is related to them, but with a different lead focus character.
Okay.
However, here's one of those cases where it makes more sense not to read in publication order. Because I know I threw a bunch of dates at you there. The final book of the original trilogy was 1978.
Correct.
Which is right between book 2 and book 3 of the Harper Hall trilogy.
Yes.
But the author, Anne McCaffrey, literally said, no, it makes more sense to read the 3 books of the Harper Hall and then go back and read The White Dragon.
So you do 1, 2, 3, 3.
Right. And the reason for that is characters that are emphasized in The White Dragon are introduced in Dragon Drums.
And so chronologically, read it the other way.
Right. And I think it had to do, she was writing both of these books kind of at the same time, but how they actually got published was reverse of what would have made more sense. So by 1979, you've got the first 6 books, and they kind of happen at the same time. These books are all happening in the same era of this setting, and I'll get more to talk about the setting in a little bit. Excuse me. She goes on to write more novels and novellas, both continuing the story as well as a number of prequel stories. And these go on from this first one in 1968 all the way to 2003. So there's a lot of books that get written over this time span. A
lot of books and a lot of time.
And short stories. And then after 2003, she started co-writing some more Pern stories with her son, Todd McCaffrey. So there's 8 more books that come out between 2003 and 2012. 3 of those Todd wrote by himself. The other The other 5 they co-wrote. The last one in 2012 they co-wrote, but it was actually published posthumously because Anne passed away in November of 2011. Since that time, there's been one more book that's come out. In 2018, I have not read this one, but in 2018, a new Pern story came out called Dragon's Code, written by her daughter now, Gigi McCaffrey. There's also a rumor that there's one more book called After the Fall is Over that's been in development since before she passed away, before Anne passed away, that rumor is eventually the kids will finish the book and publish it, but there's no target date, there's no absolute.
Now, what we do have published, do you have a number for us? How many books, at least just books, but then if you can include novellas, short stories, how many things of Pern are there?
You know, I have it open in front of me right now. I didn't count it ahead of time, so I'm doing it right now.
Because I want to compare this to what I believe was our last to read or not to read, the Shannara books.
There's not as many.
Is this more? Is this less?
There's 26, counting that newest one in 2018.
It's not that many less.
Not that many, but it is less.
26 is still a very intimidating number.
Now, what's it all about? Again, spoiler light overview.
And the writers.
I'm going to talk about dragons last.
Pern. About Pern.
As the stories begin, it's about the planet Pern. Yeah, wow, he just wants to steal everything from me.
I mean, it's in the title, you know?
On this planet, there are people like us, humans. They live mostly in rock dwellings, built into the sides of mountains, caves. There are some other homes and villages branching out, but they all tend to be around or centered around these rock structures called holds. Okay. And each of these major holds, there's major holds and there's minor holds, smaller holds. The smaller holds are all attached still to a major hold. So there's these major holds around the planet. The planet that we know here is just one big sprawling continent. Okay. And these holds each have a lord who is over the hold and responsible for the hold's well-being and for the support and care for all the people who rely on the hold. It's kind of a Middle Ages feudal type structure, but we don't have any knights and, you know, things like that going on. But still, you've got the one who's in charge.
That kind of feudal vassal system.
Right. Everyone who lives in that hold's region tithes a portion of their things to the hold and are protected and supported by the hold. It's a care for structure. So taxes are a portion of your food, a portion of your livestock, that kind of thing. And then there's also another segment of society. There's this one thing called a weir, W-E-Y-R. The weir is where the dragons and their riders live, as well as some people who just support, like kitchen staff, you know, support the dragon riders. The weir is a extinct volcano where they live. So it's this big crater and they can fly right out of it. But they live all the way around the outside. They're still living in rock, but they each have their own little spots where these dragon riders live, and their dragons are here too. Okay. And how this is set up is the dragon riders care for the dragons and they train with the dragons, and that takes all their time. The holds support the weir. So everybody tithe to the weir, to the hold. The holds tithe to the weir. So they don't raise their own food. They don't make their own stuff. Everything is given to them because they have a job to do. They have to be ready. Now, ready for what?
They
They need to be ready for the threat that is called thread. So in this series, there's this thing that falls out of the sky called
Yes, it
thread.
is the unraveled pieces of a god's clothing. And if it
It
touches
is the
you,
tapestry coming apart. No,
yeah,
thread is some sort of creature, being, virus, who knows, but it's a thing that falls in little ribbons like threads.
we can't go too
And
into that because spoilers.
whatever it lands on, whatever it touches, if it's organic, it consumes it. If it's a rock, nothing. If it's water, nothing. Unless it lands on something organic on the top of the water. But it's that organic stuff that it will just consume, burn right through. It cannot be stopped. So it's extremely deadly to anything organic. We're talking plants, we're talking livestock, we're talking wood structures. We're definitely
This is
talking
the reason
people.
why this is a planet that is barren rock. They live in these covered things, these
Yes,
holes.
because when there's threadfall, you gotta get inside. But that means you can't be outside protecting your stuff. Well, you can't protect your stuff. That's why the dragons and the riders exist, because they will fly around burning the thread out of the sky.
Because
Now,
apparently
there's
you
more
can do
about how
that.
they do that that's more spoilery than I want to talk about in this episode. But here's the crux of it when the story starts. There's just this one weir of dragons and riders. And the people in the holds, some of them are like, we're kind of tired of supporting you guys. There used to be a number of weirs around the planet, but all the other ones are abandoned. Nobody knows what happened to those dragons and their riders. They were just gone one day. But the other thing is, it's been centuries, plural, centuries, since there's been any record of thread falling. And we're still supporting these dragons and their riders. So there is an active movement as the book starts, taking impetus to say, we don't need these guys anymore.
Come on, Dragon Riders. What have you done for me lately?
Exactly. We should be done with this. If they want to still do their thing, that's fine, but they should take care of themselves. We don't need them. Problem is, they do need them.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
as the story progresses,
books.
You discover, yes, there is going to be thread again. It is coming.
It's
and
a thread.
Will they be ready? And what is the result? What happens? And how does the story play out? That's what the whole series ends up being about. And again, we get backstory, we get future story, we get lots of story.
I feel like now, future story is just story. That's why it's backstory and story.
There's many issues to address and mysteries to resolve over the course of the Pern series. And that's part of what makes it so good to read. Unpacking it, discovering what's there. Because what's going to be revealed over time, you cannot predict it when you start. There's just no way. You're not going to see it. Once things are revealed, they all make sense. They're all like, oh. I mean, a lot of that as you read your way through it. So it's very satisfying to read. But it starts out, it feels very traditional fantasy. Now, I say that because, again, where was it published first? In a science fiction magazine. Now, there wasn't a lot of fantasy magazines back then, so there was always a lot of bleed over between fantasy and sci-fi.
Always has been, always will be.
For this one, it was particularly appropriate because this series is not just fantasy. It is science fiction fantasy. You can't see it at the beginning. By the end, you're rock solid sure this is science fiction fantasy, and in a way that was just so cool. So awesome. By the way, hi, Jason. We see you're there now. Glad to have you with us here today. Yeah. So there is one more thing worthy of sharing up front about the Pern stories. Again, we're not going to spoil everything here. But I said I'd save it for the end. The world of Pern has dragons.
Yeah, we're going to talk
Okay.
about the dragons.
A little bit here. There are two different breeds of dragons, seemingly, here in Pern as we jump into the story and as the story progresses. One are these big dragons I already talked about that are in the weirs, being supported and cared for by their dragon riders.
Mm-hmm.
And there are no wild dragons of that kind. We're not looking about the mythical dragons from fantasy. That's not what these guys are. And these dragons, I say there's no wild kind, these aren't domesticated either. Rather, these are sentient, intelligent dragons who are active partners with their dragon riders, and they can communicate telepathically. They talk, okay? But they can only talk with their one rider. So they have a telepathic bond with their rider. That's explained more in the plot, so I'm not going to go deeper into that right now.
That's fair.
But there are reasons why that exists, and you learn those reasons along the way. The other kind of dragon is a small wild creature known as a fire lizard. They basically look like the dragons in miniature. Like a toy collie, miniature collie, miniature dragon, but they're just fire lizards. And previously thought to just be wild creatures, we come to learn that they actually share some of the unique qualities of their big brethren. But again, the revelation and learning about this is for the book reader, not for us to
It's
score.
okay. I'm going to say something that doesn't come from the book because I'm just going to make it up on the spot. Turns out they use the fire lizards as ammunition for their new guns that they've created that can shoot the thread out because it's sci-fi.
I'm just gonna laugh at you there. That was good. Okay, let's talk about our personal experiences with this series. I almost always go first. I want you to go first, Zach. What's your personal experience with the Dragonriders of Pern?
So I did read some of this, not a ton. We, for a long time, I don't know that we still had it. Do you still have it up in your little library?
I do. I still have these in physical form.
Yeah. There's a nice fat purple book that I believe contains like one of the trilogies. I couldn't tell you which one. I don't know if it's the original.
The omnibus of the original. Yes.
Okay, and that was the thing. I couldn't have told you if it was the original or the Harper
Hall of Pern.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I couldn't have told you which one it was because I don't remember a whole lot of it. It was one of the earlier real fantasy books that you gave me, right in that early time of I was starting to read a lot more fantasy myself.
Real fantasy as opposed to fake fantasy?
Real fantasy as opposed to YA fantasy that I admit is funky. The Pendragon series is a 10-book series, very enjoyable. It's possibly written for younger than YA for most of it, eventually gets to YA. It is fantasy. It's not real fantasy. Like, it is, okay, but it's not the adult fantasy that we think of.
So the adult fantasy, when we're not talking about adult fantasy.
Yes. Yeah. I'm like,
gotcha.
Because it doesn't have to be epic fantasy to be real fantasy. But this was the early of what is more or less real fantasy.
Okay.
And so you handed me that big purple book. And I started reading it. And then I stopped. And then I started reading it. And then I stopped. And then I started reading. I eventually got through it. But one of the reasons I don't remember it very well is like I was 8 and I started and stopped. And
maybe a little early for this series.
I remember tidbits of that first trilogy. But when A, there's 26 and B, I was 8. I don't remember a lot of it, admittedly. Maybe I'll go back.
Now, when you were 8, there weren't 26 books yet.
Correct, but barely. There were 27, probably.
There's only 26, so how can there be 27?
Sorry. I had my brain
out. Math is hard.
There were like 24 or 25, probably.
You turned 8 in 2007. They were still writing the books regularly through 2012. So there were maybe 22.
Yeah, it's like there's room, but it was probably in the 20s already.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. My personal experience, this one is a warm fuzzy for me, a warm story to remember. When I was maybe 14,
When he was a young warthog.
had my first summer job. I had some of my first own real earned money, and I joined the science fiction book club.
Nerd.
So every month I got to pick some books that would come, and I could keep them or send them back or what I wanted. I usually kept them, but to join it, I had this whole catalog of books and I could pick a certain number. I don't remember how many I could pick, but first books. I'd been getting books from the library for years, but now I'm going to own some books. And with my very first selections, I remember 2 of the books I bought.
Okay.
Well, technically 3. One was The Chronicles of Amber by Roger Zelazny in 2 omnibus forms. So the first chunk of the books and the second chunk of the books. The other I remember was the Harper Hall of Pern trilogy as an omnibus. So just one book. So knew nothing about it. This would have been back in 1984.
I have to ask,
Probably.
do you still have that copy?
No, I don't have that copy. I have repurchased them. I don't have that original copy. I will look later just in case. Maybe I still do, but
because you have some old books.
Because I loved it, so I might still have it. But I think I repurchased it. Anyways, these 3 books, I read them, and I was partly lost because it's not where the stuff starts. So there's an assumption you understand some things as you're reading the Harper Hall books that I didn't have the background. Still, I got sucked into the story as you meet the character Menely, who is a young girl working in a sea hold. So it's a fishing hold. But she's musically gifted. And one of the elements of the Pern stories is musicians are important. They're the ones who remember the history of things. And history is retained.
You were going to say they're the ones who keep them sane inside the holds.
Nope. History is told through music. Okay. And they're also then the ones who teach. So the ones who are the musicians are also the teachers, the educators, are the ones who are keeping the stories alive, keeping the knowledge alive of the world. But in her sea hold, she has musical abilities, and their harper, that's what they call them, the harper. They don't all play harps, but the harper is a very old man. And he saw her gifts, her ability, and he's teaching her. He's nurturing her in those abilities. But her parents don't dig that much because she's a girl. Girls aren't harpers. Girls, are home care people and then eventually have babies. And, all the very traditional background stuff of woman's role is right here in the story. But clearly the harper felt differently. Well, he dies of old age. And then things take a really nasty turn as they try to expunge any interest in music from her. And she ends up running away. And then it springs into a whole story from there. But the backdrop of that was just amazing. It was relevant. It was, again, this is written in the 70s. I'm reading it in the 80s where it's still very relevant, the roles of men and women and how things are transforming. And here it's in fiction in a pretty cool way. And then there's dragons. Yeah.
Did you know you wanted to go into education at that point?
It was probably just developing in my thoughts at that point. I wasn't set yet. I'm being a teacher, an educator. No. Might have had an influence. Who knows?
That's where my brain was kind of going.
Yeah. Anyways, read that. Enjoyed the whole story. Later on, I discover, there's more Pern books. Oh, and so then I went and read the original trilogy and went, oh, wow, this makes so much more sense now as I'm putting pieces together. But I think I may have enjoyed the original trilogy better because I'd already read the Harper Hall Pern. I knew some stuff about it that gave context that I would have missed if that was my first experience.
You definitely
And
enjoyed
then
the
over the
last book
years,
of
I
the
simply
original trilogy
followed.
better.
Yes, I did. I did it the way the author would want me to. Over the years, I kept hunting out and reading the Pern books, but I have to admit, I've not read any of those last books that Anne McCaffrey co-authored with her son. The last I have read of this series is the last book she wrote exclusively by herself.
So like book 18 or something.
Something. So I've got some more books I can go back and do at some point. But to be honest, I shouldn't get into this now. That's something that's going to come up later in our notes. So I'll hold that comment. All right. General strengths of the series is what we're going to move on to now. I feel there's quite a few strengths in this series. One, it has strong female characters at a time that was not necessarily being done very well across fantasy fiction.
That's valid.
And it's not just one strong woman. No, throughout the series, there are many strong female characters who are truly strong people, not just strong women. Okay, they're strong leaders, they're strong roles throughout the series. Great balance between men and women, but sometimes played against the backdrop of society as a whole where women have their place. And they're breaking that down with some of these strong women proving otherwise.
Good, because that's icky.
It also, and this wasn't necessarily, a big important thing for me at the time, but I look at it now and I go, okay, cultural relevance here is ahead of its time. It had same-sex relationships in it from the very first trilogy as a positive and meaningful part of the story, not as just some weird thing thrown out there or some bad guy character. No, it was done sensitively and genuinely, way ahead of its time in fantasy fiction.
Yeah, I mean, you said it came out first one in the 60s.
Yeah,
Very
exactly.
ahead of its time.
The blend of fantasy and sci-fi is also a strength, as the sci-fi is slowly revealed over the course of time and done, I felt, brilliantly. A real strength. Another strength, I got two more. So another strength is one you may not agree with, but I think if you read it, you would, if you got through the whole series. And that is, it covers a time period of 2,500 years from the earliest prequel to the last book that's been written. And yet, all those books tie together authentically and in significant ways. It's not just totally disjointed, disconnected stories. There is a clear see-through all the way. And even one character that connects through a good chunk of that history in a weird way.
I'll get to why I don't think I'm going to disagree with that as much as you would think I would in a minute.
All right, fair enough. The last one I'd get to is simply the depth of the characters. As I read this, I strongly and emotionally connected with these characters, what they were doing, what their goals were, what they were striving for, what their successes and failures were. There are some gut punch moments. We go all the way back to our gut punch episode, and I brought one in from this series.
Yep.
And it's one of the biggest hitting of anything I've ever read. So, yeah. Actually, I think I had two gut punch moments from Pern series.
I remember one in particular that you had mentioned that was pretty high.
So, strongly developed characters like that are always really meaningful, always powerful in a series. So, Anne McCaffrey's writing is really strong in that particular way. You can't really speak to strengths much, right?
I can't really speak a ton to strengths and weaknesses. I do want to touch on that time one.
Okay.
Simply because what I do have read and just know of the series is I'd go so far as to say the Pern series as a whole is a masterclass in world building through characters. Because it's not just a bunch of exposition and world building of that, but like you said, it has strong developed characters that you get to
Yes.
know and their place within the world. And yet this
Mhm.
world is massive and fantastical and very different from anything that at any point throughout the history of the books when they were written, at any point it drastically varies from our world. And yet you can get a really good sense of the world by the characters. And I think that's a very, very cool thing in epic fantasy in particular.
Sure. General weaknesses of the series, I only have one. Again, I am a fan of this series, so I'm going to fanboy a little bit. I can't come up with much that I didn't care for or that I felt was a weakness. But there's one thing that we recently ranted on about
Oh no.
stuff we don't care for so much in fantasy fiction.
Okay.
And that is the good guys are pretty darn good. And the bad guys are pretty darn bad. It's pretty black and white in that regard. You don't have good guys who really are flawed characters. I mean, you got some pretty heroic good guys. There are some people who make mistakes, who do things they maybe shouldn't have and have to fix it and stuff, of course. But it's pretty black and white on the good versus bad.
For as much as the series was ahead of its time with a lot of social and cultural representation, as well as you mentioned very good with its depth of characters, that doesn't always translate to a full complexity of a mixed morality. It is a good versus evil story at its core, and it really ties to that.
And there is, I mean, the bad guys, especially when the story first starts out, there's a guy who's really, he's evil. He's nasty, but he's all nasty, you know, and people have to deal with it and try to work through the problems and all. But in the end, you know, we're gonna save the day. Things are gonna work, you know.
And if that's your cup of tea, then it's not a weakness for you. But in a lot of my personal reading, I do like a likable villain, at least at times, someone that has good parts here and there that make them more interesting, as well as flawed heroes. But
Yeah,
that's,
in this
again,
series,
a preference.
the bad guys, you hate the bad guys. Now, not every book has a genuine bad guy. Sometimes it's just a bad circumstance they're having to deal with, and it's all the good guys trying to work together to overcome the bad situation. So it's not always a villain, per se. But when there's a villain, oh yeah, he just sucks. You just hate the villain.
And even so,
pretty much it.
I'm going to go far enough to say bad circumstance personified is a villain. We don't call it a villain because it's not a character, but if you consider the circumstance a character, it's a villain. And it's all bad.
So, would we ever read this series again? Well, first I have to ask Zach, would you ever go and try to read the series?
I don't know.
After your initial false start.
It's a hard one for me because I do look at those first books fondly, even though I don't even remember them very well. But I also look at it and go, this is a 26-book series of older things that I would probably enjoy. But if it doesn't grip me, then did I just commit myself to wanting to read 26 books that didn't super grip me when there's a lot of other good stuff that's more modern? And so it's harder to get me to commit to something that started that old and there. I think I may at some point, but I'll put this out here right now. It's probably going to be a few years before I make that attempt.
I would totally reread this series. In fact, I have thought to do it a few times this year. Of like, when am I going to reread Pern? Because there's a lot of nostalgia for me with it. But also, I've reread a few of the books. But I think to start the series from the beginning and go all the way through again, now with the full knowledge of what happens, I think I would get a far richer experience than I have before. I'm pretty confident of that. So I've got a plan when I'm going to do a reread. I really think I would love this.
Question. Totally
Yeah.
on the spot. You want to do a buddy read? We can get Discord in on it too. Discord doesn't have to read it.
Of working our way through the Pern series?
Why not?
Possibly. That's a
I'm
commitment.
totally putting you on the spot, and I know that you don't do well with being put on the spot, especially when we're
Jason's
recording
like, book
live
club
to everyone.
Yeah.
Why not?
Let's flesh it out. Let's work at it. Let's figure out how we might do that in just, a chunk at a time. How could we get that fit in? All right. I like it. And that gets you to read it finally.
Exactly.
And then I would finally pick up the ones I never read there at the end once we finally get there.
Might take time,
cool.
but it'll be good.
Oh, it would. Because we're reading a couple other things too along the way.
Oh, yeah. It's not going to be the only thing we're reading.
No. Okay. Rating scale 1 to 100. How do we subjectively feel this series rates in comparison to all the other fantasy fiction we've personally read?
I'll go first
For
because
me,
I think it'll be a good low ball here comparatively. Because I'm going to give it a 65 with room to only go up.
Wow, 65, huh? Yeah.
I mean, to me, that puts it above my baseline. This is fantasy by a good 15. But I mean, I'll be honest, I don't remember what I have read. So it can't be that amazing when I read it. But I do know that it's supposedly really good. There's
a huge Pern fandom out there that
yeah.
I have not connected with, but it's a thing. And there's a huge chunk of them that go to Dragon Con every year. I understand. So, which is a huge fantasy convention. So Pern has love.
Story. What I know of the story, the characters, the world is all something that I think I would be very interested in. So there is a lot of wiggle room for that 65 to go a lot higher. But
So we said right up front, this is subjective. It's how do we feel about the books you've read.
Yeah. I'm subtracting 10 off of your score for nostalgia.
I gave it a 90. Okay.
Yeah.
A 90. I loved the writing style. I loved the characters. I found a gripping plots all the way through. The reveals of what's really happening as it goes through the series, just again and again, I went, yeah. So this is the highest one of all the ones we've done for me. I love Pern.
I really wonder if it would be anywhere near that score had you read it just as an adult.
You've made such arguments in the past that we get connected to nostalgic times of our youth.
That's what I'm going, maybe not. It's totally valid if it did. I'm just curious, and there's no way for us to know.
Yeah, no way. Except if we do the reread, and then we'll see.
Yes, but also no.
All right, final question. What sort of person do we think may enjoy this series? I think anyone who enjoys nice traditional fantasy that blends with sci-fi will find stuff to sink their teeth into this series.
I think most people who are potentially interested in sci-fi, I'd actually probably say, give it a shot. If only because it very obviously is there's dragons. And anything that has dragons is going to be an easy sell to someone who's interested in fantasy, whether they know a lot about fantasy. A newbie fantasy reader probably imagines most fantasy is about dragons. They're wrong, but it's a really cool part of fantasy.
There's dragons, and they are an integral part of the series. They are real characters. Yeah, so if you like dragons, you gotta read the Dragonriders of Pern. How can you? You're missing that from your series, from your curriculum vitae, or whatever you want to call it. You gotta have the Dragonriders of Pern consumed, at least the first 6 books. I'd say if somebody's read the first 6 books and they don't want to go any further, that's fine. You've gotten a good story in, and it kind of rounded out, and it's healthy and it's entertaining. But you could stop there if you wanted to. But if it gripped you, you're going to want more. So you'll keep going. There is another logical stopping point, which I'll say, and that's about book 16 or 17. It's called All the Wares of Pern. When you've read that one, there's another part of the story arc that clearly ends. And it's a perfect ending spot if you want to stop and not read any of the others. If you get to that one, you'll have a very satisfying conclusion. But there are more stories that can be told, and that's where all the other books keep going. Yeah.
Gotcha.
All right. I think that's it. I think we've covered Pern until we start doing a book club or something with it on our Discord. If you listen to this and you want in on that, you got to let us know, because we're not going to kick it off immediately. We'll definitely wait until this gets released, and then we'll give a little time for people to think about it. We'll start planting the seeds out there and figure out how we might do that, because I do want to reread this series. That could be the opportunity. Anything else, Zach, before I run the outro?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, let me hit that then. Thanks for being here with us, everybody. We appreciate that you took the time to listen to this content. We hope you enjoyed what we had to say.
Absolutely. It's always fun to do things, whether it's our Wheel of Time content or some of these that are outside of the norm. It's really just a lot of fun to do.
Don't forget, we've got stuff showing on the screen, people. This is how you can connect with us, and we hope you will.
There and there and there too. But that one,
there too.
I don't think we've had anyone do.
Not for a long time. We'll talk to you next time.